Thanks everybody. As Miles said, I'm going to be talking about two subjects tonight.
Record.
Oh yeah, do what you want. Yeah. And one is the pyramids, mysteries of the pyramids, and what the Pentagon and the government knows about the subject. And just sort of coincidentally, which is sort of even a bit of a mystery to me, the publishers put out another book from me, which wasn't supposed to come out till next year, and they put it out like 8 weeks after the pyramids book. So it's I've kind of got two on the go, which so confuses me as the author, never mind the people who buy the books as well. So I thought I'd kind of sort of split it into two 45-minute segments. The first one on the pyramids, and you know, the book itself kind of delves into the whole ancient astronauts scenario as it relates to the pyramid. You know, the idea that were we visited in thousands of years ago by extraterrestrials, and were they responsible for some of the legends, folklore, myths, stories, beliefs relative to religion of the gods coming down from the skies and things like this. Now, of course, a lot of books have been written on this subject, you know, going back to like the days of Eric von Daniken through Zechariah Sitchin, people like that. And although I've always had an interest in this area, I've never written anything about it, because it's like, well, you know, there's a lot of good people doing solid research in these fields already. You know, why just go along and just do something that's going to replicate and copy what somebody else has done? So I've kind of steered away from it. But as I said, not through lack of interest or belief that, you know, it's worth looking into, just that, as I said, a lot of good work has already been done in that field. But one of the things that kept cropping up now and again, where I'd find a little bit of snippets of data here and there, was sort of references to secret official interests in things like the pyramids, the story of Noah's Ark, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and things like this. And the more I dug into it, the more and more leads I found, to where eventually I thought, well, you know, this is sort of telling a story that basically covers, if you look at the way the government investigates UFOs today, it's kind of like the equivalent of that, but having an entire project that looked into sort of mystical relics, ancient artifacts, lost civilizations, and ancient astronauts. And as I said, the more I dug into it, the more I found evidence of these sort of projects and sub-projects within sub-projects inside the Pentagon and other agencies, where they've compiled massive amounts of information on places like the pyramids. And so that's basically what led me to sort of do the research and finally write the book. And it sounds a bizarre subject, you know. You imagine the Pentagon spending significant dollar amounts to try and figure out how the pyramids were built. You know, you imagine that's sort of not necessarily the official mandate of the government, you know, to spend your tax dollars on, but nevertheless they were looking into it. And of course, one of the main reasons, as you can probably guess, was that when they were looking at some of these ancient artifacts with so-called magical or supernatural powers, it was, well, can we understand the technology and weaponize it for the present day, if you like? That was sort of the basic scenario. But the one area they focused on more than any other, hence the title of the book, The Pyramids of the Pentagon, was the pyramids of Egypt. Now, the reason why they were digging into this area, I was actually quite surprised to get hold of files through the Freedom of Information Act on this very area, was they were trying to determine if the legends about the pyramids and a lot of other ancient structures around the world, were they built via some sort of anti-gravity or levitation type technology. Now, whether or not that's true, you know, the fact of the matter is that is what the Pentagon was looking at, because if you go back throughout history to whether it's ancient Egypt, Stonehenge in England, the huge structures in Central America, Mexico, South America, they all have legends about these huge, gigantic, sort of multi-ton stones being moved by, back then, you know, sort of magical means. They would talk about the stones being floated into the sky and just sort of gently pushed into place. Now, of course, today that probably sounds like the closest thing we could imagine to levitation. Now, you know, if we look at the pyramids in Egypt, you know, those stones, people don't realise, you know, the sheer scale of how big, you know, the pyramids are. You know, we're talking sort of, you know, a base of like 600 feet, height 400, multi-tons, you know. Some of those stones weigh like 20 tons, you know, and they're sort of 400 feet up in the air, you know, and a lot of studies have been done. People talk about rollers and ropes and pulleys you know, to move the stones and put them in place. But, you know, a 20-ton stone, you know, dragging it or pulling it 400 feet in the air, you know, when you look at the logistics of it like that, it's sort of a pretty tough thing to do. And a lot of these stones were actually quarried several hundred miles from where the pyramids were built, or are built. That's what a lot of people don't realise. It's not like they just dug the stone out from, you know, 100 yards away and just pulled it across. We're literally talking 500 miles distance. So not only are they reportedly using just manpower, ropes and pulleys to lift the stones into place, first they've got to drag each and every single one of those 20 to 80 ton stones 500 miles, then lift them into place. And you look at how many are on just that one pyramid there. That's actually not even the Great Pyramid, you know, which is even bigger. So, you know, you have a lot of logistics to think about, and people say, well, you know, they rolled them along on, you know, tree trunks, just chopped tree trunks down and rolled them along like that. Well, that's fine, I guess, to an extent, if you're doing it on like a nice tarmacked road, you know, 3-lane highway. We're talking about the desert, you know, dragging it across sand. You know, it's like, imagine you go to, I don't know, down by Beaumont or somewhere, you know, Galveston, and you try and get a 20-ton rock and a few tree trunks and try and push it along, you know, see how far you get. If you get 500 miles, you know, I'd be amazed. And then if you could raise it 400 feet in the air, I'd be even more amazed. But if you actually look back into the original Egyptian legends, they all talk, this sounds strange what I'm going to say first, but the Egyptians, the British with Stonehenge, Central America, the Maya, the Inca, they all talk about the stones being raised by what they call magical music, or like supernatural tunes, or to the sound of a musical instrument. And what they're actually talking about in modern day technology is what's known as acoustic levitation, which is kind of like it's a bit difficult to explain it, but it's where you have what are called sort of acoustic sound waves which can be directed against each other. Kind of, you know, imagine like a magnet when it pushes against each other, and you can't push it together, two opposite poles. It's kind of like that, and between these sort of acoustic waves, if you like, is what's called the resonance zone. And there's been some success made in the labs with raising small objects in what's called this resonance zone. It's kind of like you have like a directed sound energy, and the military's actually been researching this quite a lot, to where they're now able to raise, you know, not heavy, large objects, but something like this size, weighing sort of 20 pounds, in these resonance zones. And it's all done via acoustics or sound. And if you look at the stories of the pyramids particularly, there was a 10th century writer named Al-Masudi, and he wrote back then as to how he'd heard rumours and legends from even ancient texts and books and things like that, about how supposedly the Egyptians, when they built the pyramids, had these long rows of what he described as these mysterious iron rods, and almost like an alleyway of trees, but they were like these poorly described iron rods. And he said that the stones would sort of be pushed gently along these alleyways about this high off the ground, kind of like, you know, if you're pushing a little rowing boat in the water and it would just sail along of its own accord for like 15 feet, then you push it again. And he said that's how they move the stones. From Stonehenge in England, there's a story about how supposedly somebody played a magic flute and the stones raised into the air. In the Mayan culture, they have stories about like the equivalent of an acoustic guitar being plucked and then the stones were raised up again. So, you know, we shouldn't take those stories literally, because a lot of them were sort of passed down orally over, in some cases, you know, 4 or 5 generations or 400 or 500 years. But if you sort of take away the simplistic, magical implication, you know, the folkloric distortion, all of them are talking about sound being used to raise stones. And of course the exact opposite is the idea of using it as a weapon. You know, if you look at the biblical story of the walls of Jericho being brought down by trumpets, you know, it's exactly the opposite. You know, instead of raising stones, you're using sound waves to actually destroy something. And again, that's something else that the military is working on now. It's like acoustic weapons for sort of crowd control. You know, it's like if in theory, you know, people are demonstrating about something, you know, they don't like all the cameras being put on the traffic lights or whatever, and somebody goes and complains about it, you know, there's a big demonstration in the local park. Well, the directed energy weapons or acoustic weapons, basically what they can do, imagine if you're like at a rock concert, you know, you can feel that thumping beat going through you. Well, directed sound waves can actually be used to sort of make you feel nauseous, sick, affect your nervous system, even make, you know, give you vertigo, dizziness, and basically disable you. And that's the point of these acoustic weapons. They're called non-lethal weapons, where, you know, the weapon would be pointed at you. You wouldn't see anything like a bullet or anything like that. It would just be you'd suddenly feel really ill and drop to your knees because you were being sort of bombarded by these concentrated sound waves. So that's sort of the other more disturbing angle of it, I guess. But I was sort of surprised to actually get files on this subject through the Freedom of Information Act. You know, it's one of these things you would think they wouldn't release this material, but they actually did. And it talks about how, going back to the 1950s, the Navy and the Pentagon were following the research of a man named Dr. Maurice Jessup. And Jessup was someone who was digging into a lot of interesting stuff back in the 50s. He was heavily into UFOs, but he was somebody who didn't just sort of write books from, you know, his office or whatever, or his study. He would actually go out into the field and investigate these things. And he spent a lot of time in Central America, Mexico, South America, and came back totally convinced that things like the equivalent of the Egyptian pyramids were built by extraterrestrials. He couldn't see any other way than some sort of anti-gravity or levitation to move these massive stones. You know, he came to believe that just brute force manpower and ropes and pulleys, you know, just couldn't do it. And so what he did was to go out there, get a bunch of photographs, and then write up his theories in his books. Well, what was interesting is that, you know, in addition to his regular readers who bought his books, the Navy took a great deal of interest in a book he published in 1957 called The Case for the UFO, which was basically a study of UFOs and these ancient structures. And what happened was that a copy of the book was mailed anonymously to the Navy, which had all these sort of annotations, handwritten annotations in there about the pyramids and all about secret naval experiments to try and make a warship invisible and all sorts of strange things. But when you read the annotated version, a lot of people think it focuses more on the stories about the military trying to make this warship invisible, which is actually a famous story known as the Philadelphia experiment. But the annotations actually focus more on the idea of using acoustic levitation to move stones. And the Navy, you know, instead of just ignoring it or just saying, well, that's interesting, they actually flew Jessup out to Washington, D.C. and put him up overnight, paid for his airfare and hotel room, etc., etc., and then interviewed him for like a full day on his theories about, you know, could these massive stones have been moved by some technology, you know, that could be applied today. And Jessup got sort of really concerned that, you know, here he was, some guy who was just writing books about the pyramids, and then he's being grilled in this room by two guys from naval intelligence. You know, it wasn't sort of the sort of thing you expect to see every day, I guess. And he got very sort of worried and paranoid by this whole situation. Primarily because he thought, well, if the government's watching, then obviously hit on something that's real and significant and important to them. You know, that was his line of thinking or his conclusion. And so, you know, he began getting more and more paranoid, thinking people were watching him. And I guess the very fact that they'd flown him out to Washington, D.C. suggests they probably were watching him, you know. But in 1959, he confided one day in a colleague, Dr. Manson Valentine, that he'd made a major breakthrough in all this, and he was going to reveal it the next day. But on that particular day, he was actually found dead in his car in a Florida park. This was like a hose pipe, you know, going through from the exhaust and through the front window, and he, you know, dead from carbon monoxide poisoning. Now, people said, well, maybe he's depressed and paranoid and worried about all this stuff with the Navy, which he was. But on the other hand, you know, he made this exciting phone call only 24 hours earlier saying, I've got this major breakthrough, I want to tell you about it. And of course, we don't know what that was. Some of his files seem to be missing. You know, we don't have all of those. You know, just don't know where they went. So, you know, is it a case that somebody got rid of him because he was getting too close to the truth of this, you know, acoustic technology? we just don't know. I mean, that part of the story, I admit, is sort of a bit of a grey area. But in terms of the military actually looking at these ancient stories of things like the pyramids, that's absolutely true. You know, as I said, the files, or at least some of them, are now in the public domain through the Pentagon. But again, you know, people say, well, why on earth would the Pentagon be interested? You know, it's not their job to sort of further our knowledge of archaeology or history. You know, that's for theologians and archaeologists and sort of Indiana Jones types, not agents of the government. So it's pretty clear that this sort of spin-off angle that they were looking at, you know, well, could we use the technology today? You know, could we use it on the battlefield? You know, if you imagine that you have some sort of anti-gravity aircraft that isn't going to require a runway to land, you know, isn't going to require massive amounts of fuel, but could just sort of hover, you know, land, take off, right and left-hand turns in a harsh environment, then that would be sort of a major thing. You know, it's like you take off from, I don't know, your nearest big airport, like DFW Airport. The only reason the huge runways are there is because the plane's got to get its speed up, you know. You imagine some craft that could just take off vertically, weighed a massive amounts, but wasn't sort of downweighed by gravity, you know, it could actually overcome gravity. Then you've really got a technological device that could basically dominate any country in the world. So that seems to be the reason why they were looking into all this, was the issue of sort of weaponizing the past for the present and the future, if you like. Which we probably shouldn't be surprised about if we're going to be cynical about things. So. But the more I dug into it, the more I found it wasn't just the pyramids and this acoustic levitation angle that government agencies were looking into. Probably the weirdest one of all, which also has like a religious biblical link, was the story of Noah's Ark. Now, you know, you think, why on earth would the Pentagon be looking for Noah's Ark? Well, it all goes back to 1949, when a US Air Force spy plane was flying across Turkey towards the border of the former Soviet Union. The Russians at the time were supposedly building a new military base somewhere near the border of Turkey. Because Turkey being our friends, you know, it was kind of seen as a threat to the West. So this spy plane mission got permission to fly across Turkey towards the Soviet Union to try and get as many photographs as they could. Well, the guys used Mount Ararat, which is where, according to the Bible, that Noah's Ark came to rest. They used Mount Ararat as like a guiding line as to where to fly. As they approached the mountain, one of the people on board the plane, which was like a large bomber-type spy plane, not like a, you know, just a fighter plane with one pilot or whatever, he said he could see what looked like a large boat-like object sticking out the ice. Now, Mount Ararat's about 17,000 feet high. The top few thousand feet, every day of every month of every year, it's sort of permanently ice-capped and snow-capped. You know, the top of it is like the Himalayas or something like that, Everest. And he said he could see what looked like a 600-foot long wing sticking out of part of the ice. So quite naturally they asked if they could get permission to photograph it. And of course the guys at the base said, well, yeah, of course, photograph it. We want to know what it is. So they swung the plane around. In the middle of doing that, as the plane turned, one of the other pilots or one of the other crew members on the other side said he could see a similar type wing structure on a slightly adjacent face. So they photographed that as well, and both of these look like huge wings, both about 600 feet long. Now, of course, nobody today, or even back then, would be flying an aircraft with an overall wingspan of 1,200 feet. That's if they were wings, you know. They weren't talking about these things looking like ancient wooden boats. They looked to be like, they described as like slate-coloured dark wings, but just penetrated out of the ice. They didn't just look like rock that had broken off. So they then carried on with the original mission to photograph this Russian base, returned to the base, to their home base I should say. The pictures were developed, sent to the Pentagon and then vanished for years. And a few of them actually surface now again through the Freedom of Information Act, and they show what looks like some sort of weird object, sort of semi-buried in the ice. Now, the Pentagon and both the CIA got involved because they wanted to know what this thing was. You know, had it just looked like a weird, you know, rotted old hull of a boat, they probably would have just passed it on to, you know, historians or the church, etc., and say, hey, you know, this is one for you. But they didn't do that because this looks sort of so modern, you know. I mean, it's obviously buried in the ice, which is suggesting to be there a long, long time. but it wasn't something like a bunch of old wood that had deteriorated or anything like that. And in the Pentagon, they don't call this object Noah's Ark, they call it the Ararat anomaly. That's what it's actually officially called within the Pentagon. They refer to it as the Ararat anomaly. And that's under the Freedom of Information Act, something like about 70 or 80 pages of documents have now surfaced. And one of the departments of the military that was looking into the story of whatever this thing was on Mount Ararat was an Air Force or military project called Project Moondust. And Project Moondust was basically, if you imagine, let's just say hypothetically, a Chinese spy satellite goes over the US, and it malfunctions, and let's say it crashes in an area of forest in Austin. Well, what would happen? Project Moondust was like a quick reaction military team that would go out and seal off the area. Because Moondust, its whole mission was to sort of recover foreign technology for the US to analyse, to see, are they ahead of us, are they behind, are they at a similar level. So any way for the US to get their hands on foreign technology would be handled by this group called Moondust. So that would be the situation, if a satellite crashed in the woods, they would seal it off, they would bring in like a military transporter vehicle and load all the technology off, and it would be taken to the Air Force's Foreign Technology Division at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where it would be studied, to determine how good or bad or somewhere in between it was. So the very fact that this project, Moondust, was looking at the story of Noah's Ark is suggesting that they had their eyes set on the notion or the idea that Noah's Ark was some sort of highly advanced technological device, not just, as I said, a bunch of old rotting wood. And so we know Moondust were involved, we know the CIA were involved, and the CIA have sort of had a strange relationship to the story of the Ararat anomaly, in the sense that they've said, well, yeah, we did take some photographs, we did actually sort of divert a spy satellite over there once, but we didn't really find anything, we just left it at that. But of the number of files, the small number of files that have surfaced through the Freedom of Information Act, one of them talks about how the CIA had standing orders that every time a new book was released on the subject, they would get a copy of it. That their personnel were ordered to get copies, which were housed in the library of the Scientific and Technological Intelligence Division of the CIA, which is called the S&T. And to give you one example, in 1975, there was a guy named Fernand Navarro who released a book on Noah's Ark. He was promoting it at a shopping mall in Washington, D.C. And one of the files actually talks about how people from the CIA Science and Technology Office went out to the shopping mall just in sort of plain clothes, t-shirt or open collar or whatever, and sat in the audience and listened to the lecture, and then prepared this sort of full report for the CIA as to what the latest findings were in his book. So, this kind of makes a mockery of the idea that the CIA wasn't really that interested. They're actually sending agents out to sit in the audience and, report back on who's saying what about the latest revelations on Noah's Ark. And again, like with the pyramids, something like Noah's Ark is not something you would imagine government personnel would be looking into unless there was another reason that goes beyond the sort of historical, biblical angle. And that would again seem to suggest, because Moondust were involved, they were looking at some sort of technology. One of the other guys I was closely watching in relation to this same story was a man named George Van Tassel. George Van Tassel was a very controversial character from the early years of the contactee movement. He claimed a lot of face-to-face encounters with very sort of human-looking aliens in the early 1950s and through the 60s. Now, George Van Tassel has his believers, as he has his detractors and people are somewhere in between. But what was interesting is that the FBI and the National Security Agency had held massive files on Van Tassel. I got hold of the FBI's, which is like this thick. You could prop that door open when it's that heavy, And the file basically contains evidence showing that pretty much every lecture Van Tassel gave, or conference I should say, where it's like a high-profile lecture, they were there listening and watching. And in pretty much all the lectures he gave after about 1956, he was speaking about how he believed that Noah's Ark, Noah's Ark was not like a huge ark full of animals. He believed it was like an alien ark, filled with the DNA, if you like, of animals. Now, you know, if you read and take literally the biblical account, you know, Noah supposedly took 2 by 2 animals onto the ark, you know, but if you think of the logistics of it, you know, how did he get 2 fully grown man-eating lions onto the ark, you know? I'd like to see somebody try that. I don't think that'd last very long, you know, so, or a tiger or 2 crocodiles. How do you travel the entire world before the flood's about to strike and get, you know, 2 of every animal from South America, then you zip across to Africa, then Australia, the North Pole, the polar bears and penguins or whatever, you know, it's not feasible, you know, to get 2 of every animal on the planet onto a boat would sink it, you know, because there are hundreds of thousands of different types of animals. But what's interesting is that most cultures around the world have flood legends attached to them, and they all have their own equivalent stories to Noah's Ark. Probably the most famous other one is Gilgamesh, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which talks about this, you know, god or the gods warning about a gigantic flood coming and picking a certain family or group of people to survive it. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, this giant ark comes to rest on a mountain in northern India. There's a Native American story about their gods telling them to build what they would describe as what magical canoes, which they would be populated with animals and they would survive. There's stories from England, where I'm originally from, you know, the gods coming down saying the planet's going to be decimated by a flood and picking certain people who are going to lead the way afterwards. So all cultures have these stories, they just put their own spin and interpretation on it, but it probably does suggest there were floods. But whereas the Bible talks about animals being taken on board, Gilgamesh talks about the essence of the animals being taken on board. Another one talks about the spirit of the animals, and this has been interpreted in a way that might make more sense. You know, it's kind of like, you know, like today, I mean, a woman who's trying to get pregnant, can't get pregnant, she has her eggs preserved, you know, stored, and in simple terms, frozen, if you like. Well, that's the idea that people were looking at, who the CIA was watching. The idea that maybe these arks were like gigantic alien space arks filled with sort of countless row after row after row of sort of preserved human and animal and terrestrial animal DNA, eggs, blood, etc., etc. And possibly, you know, did one of these crash on Mount Ararat and then provoke the legend of Noah's Ark with all these animals on board. Now, whether or not that's true, that's the sort of thing that George Van Tassel was talking about, this controversial contactee. And his references to this provoked a lot of interest, and these specific files were shared by the FBI with the CIA, the National Security Agency, the Air Force, where they even underlined all the stuff about Noah's Ark. So clearly there was somebody within that particular, or those particular agencies, where they'd obviously been talking about whatever this thing was on Mount Ararat and saying something like, hey, you know, anybody who talks about it, just send all the information on to us. And so, you know, although Van Tassel was a highly controversial person, you know, it's kind of ironic that the higher up people within sort of the most prestigious agencies of the US government were hanging on his every word as it related to the Noah's Ark story, which sort of goes down some interesting pathways. And we get kind of the same thing with Stonehenge in England, which of course, you know, isn't anywhere near as big as the pyramids. A lot of people don't realise actually how small Stonehenge is. You know, the major standing stones, the upright ones, are only like 18 feet high. You know, and the ones that sit atop them, you know, they're only sort of about 12 feet long. So it's actually not that big, really. But again, you have this issue of how was it built, and of course, as I mentioned with the pyramids, that there are these legends that Stonehenge was built by some sort of levitation. The stories about Merlin, the magician, who supposedly operated under King Arthur. There's a legend about him raising the stones to like magical music again, which sort of ties in with this acoustic levitation type thing that the military is developing. But what's interesting is that over the years, the British Ministry of Defence has taken a great deal of interest in the fact that there's been a lot of UFO sightings over Stonehenge. And many of these, in the last 20 years or so, have been what are known as the black flying triangle kind. I don't know if any of you have heard of the flying triangles. Well, you know, people think of UFOs, you think of flying saucers. But in the last sort of 20, 25 years, more and more people are reporting these huge black triangular shaped craft, which, you know, some people say, well, could there be a next generation military craft, like a beyond the stealth bomber, that kind of thing, which isn't impossible, but when we look into it further, we see that what's actually happening is that there's more and more of these reports today, but they actually go back as long as UFOs have been seen in the flying saucer variety. There were just less of them. So it's not so much that they've suddenly just appeared, they're just becoming more and more visible. But a lot of these sightings of these black flying triangles have been reported from Stonehenge. And Stonehenge is built on a piece of land called Salisbury Plain. And Salisbury Plain it's like a huge expanse of just fields and woods. But part of it is actually owned by the military. It's where they have sort of manoeuvres and operations, you know, and sort of test runs for going into warfare to train the troops. So it's off limits to the general public. It's like 27 square miles. It falls under government jurisdiction.
Right next to Stonehenge? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's like behind where you have Stonehenge there, there's the main road, then you've got Stonehenge. It's all on what's called Salisbury Plain, but you go maybe a mile back and you just come to a big line of fence. And that's where it's all owned by the military. But the military's own personnel there have reported a lot of weird experiences that seem to be tied in with the stones. Wiltshire, where Stonehenge is found, is also home to what's called the Avebury Stones, which is this huge stone circle. And both at Stonehenge and the Avebury Stones, the people reported these strange little balls of light sitting between the stones, which anywhere from sort of like a golf ball up to about a basketball size. But what's interesting is that people describe these these balls of light as almost like under intelligent control. That's to say, or they were some sort of an energy-based intelligence themselves, where people tried to get close to them, and the lights have sort of bobbed up and down, and then as they got even closer, they backed away, and then stopped, and then the person gets a bit closer, and they back a little bit further away. As if, you know, whereas we're sort of flesh and blood and bone, you know, could this be like an intelligent energy, if you like? And what's interesting is that these same balls of light have been seen over the crop circles, most of which appear in the same county every year, which is Wiltshire. And just a few years ago, the British Ministry of Defence released a report called the Condign Report, which addressed the idea of whether some UFOs at least could be, as they described them, as plasmas, sort of like strange balls of light. But the MOD wondered if these plasmas could actually have an effect on the human mind. And there's references in there to, if they could have an effect on the human mind, can we make a weapon out of it? You know, it comes back to the same thing. But again, all these weird balls of light were being seen around primarily Stonehenge and the Avebury Stones. That was the Ministry of Defence's main focus. So again, it seems to be the same thing going on, whether it's Britain or America, that, you know, the interest in these ancient mysteries is provoked by, can we learn something from them that, you know, the military can use, rather than can we learn something that tells us more about our mysterious history as a species, which I guess from our perspective, we'd probably like to go with the latter. You know, for the military's perspective, it's more, you know, what can we do with it, you know, which is understandable. You know, I understand that, you know, they want to kind of improve their weaponry, I suppose. But, you know, we get this everywhere, where you have these ancient technologies and these ancient myths of the, you know, the people of that era having access to technologies that we've either lost or forgotten about. And this is reflected in some of the files where they talk about the idea that, you know, if the pyramids were built by something like levitation or anti-gravity, they're not talking about some vast machinery, you know, and factories powering these things, because we'll probably find evidence. You know, we've got the pyramids, so if you know, we're talking about massive mechanized machines that are somehow powering it somehow, why wouldn't we find evidence of those as well? You know, arguably we should. So they were looking at the idea of whether or not ancient man possessed technologies or energies very different to ours, maybe even more of like a mind-based, you know, like a psychic phenomenon, you know, actually using the power of the mind to lift stones, you know, in the same way that we would sort of just use your hands. You know, the idea was that they were looking at, you know, have we today developed technologically, but have we lost part of our the abilities of the human mind to actually perform fantastic tasks. And it's kind of like people who have visions of the future, or you think about someone you haven't spoke to for a while, and then they suddenly phone up 5 minutes later, that kind of thing. That's almost like a random use of these sort of latent psychic powers that I think all of us do have, but we've forgotten how to harness it on like a permanent, really sort of strong fashion. And that's one of the areas they were looking at, the idea that, well, maybe ancient man knew how to just switch that on just like that, and could apply it. So in other words, they were considering the possibilities that in the very, very distant past, there could have existed ways and means to build these that just didn't involve, sort of machinery and cranes or anything like that at all. And that wouldn't necessarily, there wouldn't be anything left because it was all being literally powered by the human mind. So, again, but whether it's true or not, it's still fascinating that the Pentagon, would be sort of having round table think tank discussions on this particular theory. But for me, the most sort of fascinating aspect of all this related to a very ancient text called the Mahabharata. And the Mahabharata, for those who don't know what it is, it's a very ancient Indian text that's been suggested it goes back sort of 6,000 to 8,000 years BC, which is a long way. Even though our planet is billions of years old, in terms of the human race, when you start going back sort of 10,000 BC, it actually starts to get foggy even then. And then we're just down to simplistic stories of cavemen, and things like that. But then you have sort of this weird situation where it's so foggy that we go from cavemen to people building pyramids. It's like it changed almost overnight, where there should have been like a gradual process. It's one of the things a lot of people forget with the people in Egypt, the Egyptians, or whoever built the pyramids. There's some theories that maybe the Egyptians actually inherited them, moved into the area, and that we don't really know who built them. But if it was the Egyptians, they went from being sort of just hunter-gatherers to being able to move stones and build something like that. It's like we don't see evidence in history of a gradual process. Like with us, you have the Industrial Revolution, where you go from having the wheel and a horse and cart, and then you develop steam engines and propeller-driven aircraft, jet planes, spacecraft. We don't see that. They go from one thing to the next. So this has sort of given rise. Could there have been ancient civilizations that came before us that possibly we're seeing the remnants of, or some of their ancient history survived and was passed on to the next generation, and it got sort of distorted and lost in folklore. And this is sort of what relates to this book called the Mahabharata, this ancient Indian text. And it talks about a very ancient war in northern India. And as I said, there are ideas it could be 8,000 years old, 10,000. There are some rumours that the Mahabharata might be based on an even more ancient text. We could be talking about 30 or 40,000 years ago. And if that is the case, that would sort of blow away all the theories on when the human race really began to develop in terms of cities, writing, civilizations, culture, etc. But it's kind of like if we got destroyed tomorrow, what would be left of us 40,000 years time if it was like a really massive worldwide disaster? The people of that era would just say, oh, those stories that people came before us, it's just folklore. There was no such legendary place as America or whatever, it's just somebody wrote about it in an old folklore book and it got distorted and passed down. But the Mahabharata, imagine an ancient text, say written, 10, 20, 30, 40,000 years ago, and two rival factions going to war. You'd imagine sort of, guys on horseback, bows and arrows, spears, that kind of thing. Well, the Mahabharata actually talks about something totally different. It talks about these two opposing forces having these giant iron rods that they could unleash into the sky from the ground, and that would hit cities, and there'd be this blinding flash, and the entire city would just be decimated, flattened. They talk about the opposing armies, as I said, not on horseback with bows and arrows, but flying in the sky in these craft called vimanas. And when you read the translation, they actually talk about the vimanas being powered by an engine of mercury. Not even talk about being floated into the sky by balloons. And for all intents and purposes, when you read it, it sounds like a Top Gun type dogfight in the sky. And it also talks about these Vermonters unleashing these iron rods at the cities and just destroying them, you know, just nothing left at all. Also talks about this massive plume of smoke that would hang in the sky like 2 miles high for weeks, which, you know, kind of sounds like a mushroom cloud, you know, after an atomic bomb explosion. And the really interesting thing is it talked about how the people in the area, in the hours and the days and weeks afterwards, they would start to fall sick. The hair would fall out, the fingernails would fall out, they'd be vomiting, passing blood, and then they'd die. All those symptoms are classic symptoms of radiation poisoning. You know, it's kind of like today. I mean, you know, God forbid it ever happened, but if you know, there was a nuclear war or a dirty bomb goes off, you know, it's not enough to say, well, the blast was on the other side of Austin, I'm okay. You know, if the wind blows, and your windows are open and radioactive dust comes in and you breathe it in, you know, you don't have to breathe much in before, you know, you've got radiation poisoning and, you know, your white blood cell count goes out of control and, you know, you're dead in hours in some cases. That's one of the, you know, if you're not in the blast area, that's the major thing, is the radiation poisoning. But the Mahabharata, it actually sounds like it's describing all the effects of radiation poisoning or an atomic war, from the, you know, this vast plume of smoke just hanging there for days, which sounds like the mushroom cloud. You know, the huge bright flash is the, you know, the flash of the explosion. They even talk about the temperature dropping and the sky turning black. And in scientists who research, you know, what would happen in an atomic war, they point out that because these explosions are so massive, they would kick billions of tons of dirt and dust into the sky, which would settle in the atmosphere and create what's called a nuclear winter, where the sun's ability to get through this thick, dense cloud, you know, the sun would, its ability to shine on the Earth would be reduced by like 85%. You know, you imagine the temperature takes us down to, like, say, 25 degrees for 10 years until the clouds started to clear. That's what they're talking about. And again, the Mahabharata describes all this, which sounds like this nuclear winter. What's most intriguing is that one person more than any other who was fascinated and arguably obsessed by the Mahabharata was Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, who was the father behind the atomic bomb. He developed, I won't say single-handedly, but he basically ran the program that led to the creation of the 2 atomic bombs that were dropped on Japan to end the Second World War. And he was speaking at a conference in 1952 in Washington, D.C., and he was asked, you know, when were the first atomic bombs used? He said, and somebody said, you know, is it the ones we dropped on Japan? And he said, yes, it was. And then he paused and he said, in modern times, as if to say, you know, maybe we're the first, at least in our civilization, but not the first period. And he came to believe, although, you know, he was careful on what he worded it, and how he said it, he basically said, well, or came to the conclusion that we weren't the first, and maybe there were people like us who developed atomic energy in the past. But he didn't believe it was sort of like an entire worldwide civilization like ours, because, you know, even if we destroyed ourselves, there would still be a lot of devastation left, you know. And he came to believe it may have been sort of localized pockets where, you know, one nation was highly advanced, maybe like India or Egypt or some of the South American countries, whereas maybe, you know, whole swathes of Europe weren't, or China or whatever. Yeah, it's kind of like today, you know, we take things like the internet for granted, but there are still tribes in South America that, you know, hunt with bows and arrows. So, in other words, the idea that maybe in the distant past, when there weren't obviously nowhere near as many people on the planet, you know, could it have been the case that cultures flourished and destroyed themselves and then provoked legends like Atlantis, you know, and today we laugh at them, we say, oh, there's no such place as Atlantis. Well, maybe there wasn't by that name, but maybe it was sort of a distorted legend based around stories like this. And again, Atlantis and these ancient stories were studied deeply by the Pentagon. Another controversial character that looked into all this was a man named Edgar Cayce, who was a sort of prophet and psychic, and he came to believe that Atlantis, at least there was a basis of fact behind the legend. And the CIA actually opened a file on Cayce and all his Atlantis research. And there's even a rumour, which I haven't been able to prove, but it is in print, that supposedly the CIA infiltrated his headquarters, which is based in Virginia Beach, which still exists. You can go out to cases, sort of archives at Virginia Beach, but there's a story about the CIA managing to get somebody on the payroll there and report back, what all the files contain. So, we see a lot of evidence going in a lot of different directions as it relates to, what the Pentagon was interested in, everything from the pyramids to Stonehenge, to Morris Jessup and his anti-gravity research, to Noah's Ark, to the Avery Circle, the Avery Stones, and even to the Mahabharata and, ancient atomic warfare. And, the first to admit it's sort of an area that hasn't been explored that much before, the idea of what the government knows about sort of the ancient astronauts, ancient civilization angle. I wouldn't be surprised if more comes out in the same way that, 20 years ago, when files started to surface from the government on UFOs, more and more has come out over time. And I think that will probably happen as we go further ahead in this field. So that's sort of like a broad outline on at least what we know the government knows, or suspects at least. And I think it's probably fair to say that the government suspects more than it can actually prove. It's like sometimes we give governments more credit than they're due, in terms of their ability to find information. If we're talking about something occurred 6,000 years ago, even they're going to have their limits on actually proving it versus theorising on it, which are two very, very different things. So I think they've got a lot of suspicions that the past isn't just as it appears to be, or the past isn't just, as black and white as the gods came down and Noah's Ark was this old boat. I think they have a lot of theorising and ideas, but maybe they're still scratching their heads, to a fairly significant degree. So, with that said, we'll go on from the pyramids to